When did something happen to you that was straight out of a horror movie? I was hiking my favorite trail when a hand reached out behind a bush and latched onto my arm, scaring the crap out of me. A skinny, filthy woman hiding in the dirt whispered, "Please help me." She looked like she'd been living in the woods for weeks with matted hair full of leaves, dirt caked under her fingernails, and clothes that were basically rags hanging off her skeletal frame. She said her name was Samantha, and she'd escaped from a cabin where a man had kept her chained for 3 months, and he was out looking for her right now because she'd only gotten away an hour ago. Her wrists had raw red rings where restraints had been, and she kept looking over her shoulder, flinching at every sound in the forest. I immediately gave her my water bottle, which she drank so fast she choked, and I told her we needed to get to my car and get her to the police. She said the man knew these woods perfectly because he'd hunted here his whole life, and he'd find us before we made it down. I'd started hiking at 5 in the morning to beat the crowds, so there was literally no one else on the trail who could help us. I pulled out my phone to call 911 but had no signal this deep in the trail. Samantha started crying, saying he'd kill us both if he caught us, that he'd already killed other women, and she'd seen their bodies in a freezer in his basement. My hands started shaking as I realized we were 3 miles from the parking area with no cell service and apparently a killer hunting us. Samantha could barely walk because her feet were cut up from running barefoot, so I gave her my extra socks and boots from my pack even though they were too big. We started down the trail as fast as she could manage, but she kept stumbling and I had to support her weight. Every bird that flew up made us both jump, and every branch that cracked made Samantha whimper and try to hide. She said he had dogs and rifles and knew every shortcut on this mountain. About a mile down, Samantha grabbed my arm and pointed through the trees at movement on the ridge above us. I saw a figure up there, too far to make out details, but definitely watching us. Samantha started hyperventilating, saying that was him and we needed to run. But she could barely walk, let alone run, and the trail was steep and covered in loose rocks. We kept moving, and I kept checking behind us, and the figure was following along the ridge, staying parallel to us, but up higher where he could see everything. Samantha said he was waiting for the trail to curve back toward his position because he knew the mountain better than anyone. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as we tried to move faster, but Samantha's legs kept giving out. I heard a dog bark somewhere above us, and Samantha completely froze, shaking so bad she couldn't take another step. She said he used the dogs to track the other women who'd tried to run. The barking got closer, and now I could hear multiple dogs, maybe 3 or 4, and they sounded like they were heading straight down the mountain toward us. I pulled Samantha off the trail into thicker brush, hoping to hide, but she said the dogs would find us by scent. We kept pushing through the undergrowth, branches tearing at our clothes and skin, trying to put distance between us and the barking. The sound of the dogs suddenly got much louder, and Samantha whispered they'd been released. They were running loose now. I could hear them crashing through the brush above us, getting closer every second. We reached a small creek, and I remembered something about water throwing off scent, so I pulled Samantha into it even though she was crying that it was too cold. We waded downstream, the icy water, Samantha barely able to stay upright on the slippery rocks. Behind us, the dogs reached where we'd entered the water and started barking frantically, circling and sniffing. Then I heard a man's voice calling out, "Samantha, I know you're close. Just come back and I won't hurt your friend." We kept moving downstream, but the creek was getting deeper, and Samantha couldn't swim. The dogs had found our trail again. I could see them now through the trees, big German shepherds, and behind them a man with a rifle. He was maybe 200 yards back, but closing fast. Samantha slipped on a rock and went under, and I had to grab her and pull her up, both of us gasping from the cold. When I looked back, the kidnapper was much closer, and he'd raised his rifle. I heard a crack, and a bullet hit the water next to us, sending up a spray. Samantha screamed, and I pulled her behind a boulder as another shot chipped rock fragments off right where we'd been standing. The man yelled, "Next one won't miss! Come back now!" We were trapped behind the rock with freezing water rushing around us, Samantha going hypothermic, and this psycho with a rifle getting closer. The dogs had reached our position on the bank, barking and snarling just 15 feet away, and I could hear the kidnapper walking toward us. Samantha was barely conscious, her lips blue, unable to move. I could hear him loading another round into his rifle, his footsteps getting closer, maybe 30 feet away now. The footsteps stopped right above us, and I heard the metallic click of him working the rifle's bolt. Samantha's whole body went slack against me, and her breathing got so shallow I could barely feel it against my chest. The dogs were snarling and pacing on the bank just above our heads, their claws scraping on the rocks. I felt around underwater with my free hand and found a bunch of smooth creek stones. I grabbed as many as I could hold and threw them hard downstream, making big splashes about 20 feet away. The rifle swung toward the sound and fired, the crack so loud my ears rang. I used those few seconds to pull Samantha sideways into this undercut section of the bank where the water had carved out a shallow cave. The overhang blocked the dogs from jumping straight down on us, but they were going crazy up there, barking and digging at the edge. I pressed 2 fingers against Samantha's neck and found her pulse, weak and uneven, skipping beats. Her lips had turned this awful purple-blue color, and her skin felt like ice. The cold water was killing her, and I knew we had maybe minutes before her body shut down completely. But if we moved now, that rifle would cut us down. I looked upstream and saw a big fallen tree lying across the creek about 15 feet away, its trunk making a bridge to the other side. I made the hardest choice of my life right then. I propped Samantha against the bank in the deepest part of the shadow and pushed myself out into the open, sprinting for that tree. The rifle cracked and bark exploded off the trunk right where my head would have been if I hadn't ducked. I threw myself across the log and rolled down the opposite bank, making as much noise as possible, crashing through the bushes. I kept moving loud and fast, snapping branches and kicking rocks, anything to keep his attention on me and away from where I'd left Samantha. The kidnapper was shouting commands at his dogs, and I could hear him moving along the creek edge, his boots crunching on gravel as he tried to track where I'd gone. I circled back through the thick brush, thorns ripping at my face and arms, leaving bloody scratches everywhere. The undergrowth was so dense I had to push through with my whole body, branches catching my clothes and hair. I could hear 2 of the dogs following my trail, while the other 2 stayed with their master, their barking getting closer behind me. I crashed through a wall of blackberry vines that tore my shirt to shreds and finally reached the creek again downstream from where I'd left Samantha. I slipped back into the water and waded upstream, staying low, the current pushing against my legs. I found her exactly where I'd left her, slumped against the bank, her head barely above water. Her body was completely limp when I pulled her up, no response at all, just dead weight in my arms. I threw her arm over my shoulder and started dragging her downstream, keeping us both in the water even though the cold was making my muscles cramp. Every step was agony, my legs burning from the effort of fighting the current while supporting her weight. The dogs had found where I'd crossed back into the creek, and now they were splitting up, 2 of them crashing through the brush on my trail, while 2 stayed with the kidnapper on the opposite bank. I could hear them getting closer, maybe 50 feet behind us now, their barking echoing off the rocks. Up ahead I spotted a concrete pipe, a culvert running under what looked like an old logging road, the opening just visible through the trees. I half-carried, half-dragged Samantha toward it, her feet dragging in the water behind us. The pipe was maybe 3 feet wide, barely big enough for a person to crawl through. I pushed Samantha in first, shoving her limp body into the dark opening, then squeezed in after her. The bottom of the pipe was covered in nasty mud and debris, sticks and leaves and trash that had washed in during storms. We had to crawl on our bellies through the muck, the smell of rot and stagnant water making me gag. Samantha wasn't moving at all, and I had to push her ahead of me, inch by inch, through the freezing slime. The pipe was longer than I'd thought, maybe 30 feet and completely dark in the middle where no light reached. My shoulders scraped against the concrete sides, and I felt things moving in the mud beneath us, probably rats or bugs. Behind us I could hear the dogs barking at the pipe entrance, their sounds echoing through the tunnel. The kidnapper's voice followed, yelling something I couldn't make out over the noise. I kept pushing Samantha forward, the mud so thick it was like crawling through cold pudding. Her body was completely limp, offering no help at all, just dead weight I had to shove through the muck. Finally, I saw light ahead, the other end of the pipe, and I pushed harder, desperate to get us out of this nightmare tunnel. We emerged on the other side, covered head to toe in black mud and slime that stank like a sewer. The stink was so bad I almost threw up, but at least the mud coating us might mess with the dogs' noses. I heard the kidnapper's voice echoing from inside the pipe behind us, angry and yelling at his dogs who were barking like crazy at the entrance we'd just crawled through. I dragged Samantha further from the pipe opening into some thick bushes, her body completely limp and not responding to anything. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone, wiping mud off the screen with my already filthy shirt. 1 bar of signal appeared for just a second, and I typed as fast as I could with my frozen fingers, just managing to send 911 help with our GPS location before the signal died again. The message showed as sent, and relief flooded through me for about 2 seconds before I heard something that made my blood run cold. An ATV engine roared to life somewhere up the hill, loud and getting louder. Samantha's eyes fluttered open for a moment, and she mumbled something I could barely hear about another drainage tunnel, a bigger one she'd seen during her escape. The ATV was definitely coming our way now, using the old logging roads to get ahead of us. I grabbed Samantha under her arms and started dragging her through the undergrowth, branches scratching my face and arms as I pulled her dead weight. Her legs weren't working at all anymore, just dragging behind us, leaving marks in the dirt. Every few steps I had to stop and listen for the dogs or the ATV, trying to figure out which direction they were coming from. The engine sound got way louder, and through the trees I saw headlights bouncing down the logging road maybe 100 feet away. I pulled Samantha behind a huge fallen oak tree just as the lights swept right over where we'd been standing. The ATV stopped and the engine cut off, leaving this awful silence except for my own breathing that sounded way too loud. I pressed my fingers against Samantha's neck, searching for a pulse, and finally found one, but it was so weak I could barely feel it. Her skin felt like ice, cold and waxy, looking even through all the mud. I rubbed her arms and chest as hard as I could, trying to get some warmth into her body while staying hidden behind the log. The dogs burst through the bushes about 30 feet from us, but something was different. They were running in circles, sniffing the ground where we'd crossed earlier, confused and whining instead of their usual tracking behavior. The mud and creek water had definitely messed up their ability to follow our scent. One of them kept circling back to where we'd been, nose to the ground, unable to figure out where we went next. I made a quick decision and pulled off my muddy shirt, tying it around a thick branch. With all the strength I had left, I threw it as far as I could in the opposite direction from where we needed to go. The dogs immediately took off after it, barking and crashing through the bushes toward where it landed. I lifted Samantha up in a fireman's carry, her weight making my muscles scream in protest, and started moving toward where she'd pointed earlier. My ankle rolled hard on a hidden root, and pain shot up my leg like someone had stabbed me with a hot knife. I bit down on my lip to keep from crying out and kept moving, limping now but not stopping. Through the trees ahead, I could finally see what Samantha had been trying to tell me about. A concrete drainage pipe, way bigger than the one we'd crawled through, maybe 4 feet across, running under what looked like a real road. I could hear cars passing overhead, actual traffic, normal people who had no idea what was happening down here. My heart started pounding with hope as I stumbled toward it, Samantha's weight getting heavier with every step. The pipe opening was partially hidden by overgrown vines and bushes, which was probably why the kidnapper hadn't found it yet. I could still hear the dogs barking in the distance where they'd chased my shirt, but it wouldn't be long before they figured out they'd been tricked. The kidnapper's voice carried through the trees, calling the dogs back, sounding angry and frustrated. I pushed through the vines covering the pipe entrance and saw it went all the way under the road, maybe 40 feet to the other side. Water trickled through the bottom, just a few inches deep, and the concrete walls were covered in green slime and moss. I shifted Samantha's weight on my shoulders and ducked into the tunnel, my back screaming from carrying her. The sound of traffic overhead echoed through the pipe, cars and trucks passing by completely unaware. My injured ankle nearly gave out when I stepped on the slippery bottom, but I caught myself against the wall and kept going. Behind us, I heard the ATV start up again, the engine revving hard as the kidnapper raced along the logging road trying to figure out where we'd gone. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, each step harder than the last with Samantha's unconscious weight on my shoulders. Light appeared at the far end, actual daylight, and I pushed myself to move faster even though every muscle in my body was on fire. We were almost there, almost to the other side where there were cars and people and help. I pushed Samantha into the tunnel opening first, and her body went completely limp as she collapsed in the shallow water at the bottom. I crawled in right behind her, and my shoulders scraped hard against the rough concrete sides that were way tighter than they looked from outside. Cold water trickled through the bottom of the pipe and soaked through my pants and shirt as I grabbed Samantha under her arms and started dragging her deeper into the darkness. My back muscles burned from the awkward position, but I kept pulling her further from the entrance until we were maybe 20 feet in where the light barely reached us. I remembered the emergency blanket in my pack and fumbled with the zipper with numb fingers until I found the small packet. The metallic material crinkled loud in the confined space as I shook it out and wrapped it around Samantha's shaking body. Her skin felt like ice, and she wasn't responding when I said her name, but at least she was still breathing. That's when I heard his voice echoing from the tunnel entrance, and my whole body went rigid with fear. "I know you're in there!" A rock flew past us in the darkness and clattered off the concrete wall just inches from my head. He was trying to scare us out, but the tunnel was too small for him to fit through easily, and I could tell from his voice he wasn't coming in after us. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and couldn't believe what I saw on the screen. 2 bars of signal showed in the corner, and my earlier 911 text had actually gone through with an automated response asking for more details. My fingers were so cold and wet I could barely type, but I managed to text our exact location using the GPS coordinates on my screen. I told them about the armed kidnapper hunting us, and that Samantha was dying from hypothermia and needed immediate medical help. The battery warning flashed 5%, and my stomach dropped knowing the phone could die any second. I hit send just as a gunshot exploded into the tunnel, and the sound was so loud in the confined space my ears started ringing. The bullet bounced off the concrete walls, and I felt burning pain slice across my forearm where a fragment caught me. Blood started soaking through my sleeve, and I pressed my other hand against the wound to stop the bleeding. I knew we needed help fast, or we were both going to die in this pipe, so I started whistling as loud as I could. 3 sharp blasts over and over, the sound echoing out both ends of the tunnel and hopefully reaching someone, anyone who might hear us. My lips were numb from cold, but I kept whistling that pattern again and again while pressing against my bleeding arm. Then I heard the most beautiful sounds in my entire life above us on the road. Car doors slammed and voices started shouting, and then a siren came screaming toward us, getting louder every second. The kidnapper cursed, and I heard his footsteps running away from the tunnel entrance as more car doors slammed above us. I kept whistling and shouting, "Help! We're down here!" until I saw flashlight beams sweeping across the tunnel entrance. "This is Park Ranger Perry! Is someone in there?" A woman's voice called out, and my whole body started shaking with relief so hard I could barely answer.
Yes, please help us. She's dying.
Ranger Perry crawled into the tunnel with a big medical kit and a headlamp that lit up the whole space as she moved toward us. She was talking into her radio calling for backup and an ambulance while checking Samantha's neck for a pulse. "She's hypothermic and going into shock," she said while pulling out warming packs from her kit. She activated them and tucked them under the emergency blanket around Samantha's core and neck while checking her breathing. More flashlights appeared at the tunnel entrance, and I heard deputies shouting orders and the kidnapper's ATV roaring away in the distance. But I didn't care about him anymore. All that mattered was that Samantha was getting help, and we were finally safe. Ranger Perry wrapped gauze around my bleeding arm while keeping one hand on Samantha's wrist, checking her pulse. "You did good getting her this far," she said. "The ambulance is 2 minutes out, and we've got units pursuing the suspect." She pulled out an oxygen mask and fitted it over Samantha's face while more deputies crawled into the tunnel to help. My vision started getting fuzzy around the edges, and Perry noticed right away. "Hey, stay with me," she said, and wrapped another emergency blanket around my shoulders. "You're both going to be okay now." The paramedics arrived and had to carefully slide Samantha onto a backboard to get her out of the tunnel without hurting her more. They started an IV right there in the pipe, and I watched the clear fluid drip into her arm while they worked. When they finally pulled me out of the tunnel, my legs wouldn't work right, and a paramedic had to basically carry me to the second ambulance. The last thing I saw before they closed the doors was deputies spreading out through the woods with flashlights and dogs searching for the kidnapper who'd tried to kill us both. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and we were racing down the mountain with sirens blaring while the paramedic kept working on Samantha's IV line. Her skin looked gray under the bright lights, and the heart monitor kept beeping way too slow, but at least she was still breathing. I could hear more sirens outside and saw cop cars flying past us heading up toward where we'd come from. The paramedic wrapped another heated blanket around me and checked my arm where the bullet fragment had grazed it. Blood had soaked through my sleeve, and when he cut it away, I saw a 3-inch gash that was deeper than I'd thought. He cleaned it with something that burned like crazy and started wrapping gauze around it while asking me questions about what happened. I tried to explain about the kidnapper and his dogs, but my teeth were chattering, so bad I could barely talk. The hospital emergency room doors burst open as they wheeled us in, and suddenly there were doctors and nurses everywhere. They rushed Samantha straight through some double doors marked trauma, while a nurse helped me onto a different gurney. My legs felt like rubber and wouldn't work right, so she had to basically lift me up. She cut away the rest of my wet clothes and got me into a hospital gown while another nurse started checking my vitals. My core temperature was 94 degrees, which apparently meant mild hypothermia. They hooked me up to warm IV fluids and piled heated blankets on me while cleaning all the cuts and scrapes from running through the woods. A doctor came in to stitch up my arm, giving me a local anesthetic that made the whole thing go numb. While he worked, a detective in a brown suit walked in holding a notepad. "I'm Detective Callahan," he said. "Can you tell me what happened out there?" I told him everything from the beginning, about finding Samantha hiding in the bushes and her saying she'd escaped from a cabin. I described the man following us with his rifle and dogs, how he'd shot at us in the creek. I told him what Samantha had said about being chained for 3 months and seeing other women's bodies in a freezer. Detective Callahan wrote everything down, asking me to describe the kidnapper in detail. I told him the man was maybe 6 feet tall with dark hair and a beard, wearing hunting camo and carrying what looked like a bolt-action rifle. I explained about the cabin Samantha mentioned, somewhere up the mountain where he'd kept her prisoner. The detective said they had units searching the whole area and roadblocks set up on every route off the mountain. A woman in business clothes came in next, introducing herself as Jasmine Simmons, a victim advocate. She said Samantha was stable but still unconscious in the ICU. "She's going to need extensive treatment, both physical and psychological," Jasmine explained. "What she's been through is going to take a long time to process." She gave me her card and said she'd be working with Samantha when she woke up. The nurse came back to check my temperature, which had finally gotten back to normal. My whole body ached, and I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop thinking about Samantha fighting for her life down the hall. They moved me to a regular room for observation, and I must have passed out because when I woke up it was morning. Detective Callahan was back with news that search teams had found the cabin exactly where Samantha had described it. "We found evidence of multiple victims," he said quietly. "The freezer she mentioned was there." My stomach turned thinking about what they must have discovered. He said the forensics team was processing everything, and they'd already connected it to several missing persons cases. 3 days later, I was back home watching the news when they announced they'd caught him. Someone at a gas station 2 counties over had recognized him from the alerts and called it in. They showed his mugshot on TV, and seeing his face made my hands shake all over again. He was charged with kidnapping, attempted murder, and multiple counts of murder going back years. I went to visit Samantha at the hospital a week after everything happened. She was awake but still weak, hooked up to monitors and IV drips. When she saw me, she started crying and grabbed my hand. "You saved my life," she whispered. "I knew I was going to die out there until you helped me." Her wrists were bandaged where the restraints had cut into her and she'd lost so much weight she looked fragile. but her eyes were clear and determined when she talked about testifying against him. The FBI got involved when they realized the kidnapper had victims across 3 states. Agents came to interview both of us separately, taking detailed statements about everything. They said Samantha's survival was crucial because she was the only victim who'd escaped and could testify about what he'd done. They were connecting him to missing women going back almost a decade. Samantha's testimony would help bring justice for all those families who'd been wondering what happened to their daughters and sisters. The weight of that hit me hard, knowing how close we'd come to her being another victim who just disappeared. If I hadn't gone hiking that specific morning at that exact time, if she hadn't managed to escape right when she did, if we hadn't made it to that drainage tunnel, she would have ended up in that freezer with the others. The hospital moved Samantha to a special trauma recovery unit 2 days later, with security guards checking everyone who came through the doors and cameras in every hallway. I drove up to visit when her therapist called, saying it would help her recovery to see familiar faces who weren't connected to the trauma. Samantha was sitting up in bed working with a physical therapist to strengthen her legs when I walked in, and she grabbed my hand so tight it hurt. The therapist had her doing simple exercises like lifting her knees and flexing her feet, things that should have been easy but left her shaking and sweating. Every day she pushed herself harder, first standing with help, then taking a few steps with a walker, then finally walking the hallway on her own while nurses watched carefully. 6 weeks after our escape, I sat in the courthouse waiting room with my hands sweating while lawyers prepared for the preliminary hearing. They brought the kidnapper in wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles on his wrists and ankles, and seeing him chained up like that made my nightmares feel less scary somehow. I told the judge everything about finding Samantha and our escape, while the kidnapper sat there staring at me with dead eyes. The prosecutor showed photos of the cabin, the freezer, the chains, and I had to look away when they displayed pictures of the other victims. Samantha kept getting stronger every single day, working with 3 different therapists who helped her relearn how to trust people and sleep without nightmares. She told me during one visit that she was determined to testify at the trial and make sure he never got out to hurt anyone else. 3 months after everything happened, Samantha moved into a safe house near her sister's place where she could continue recovery with family support nearby. She'd gained back 20 pounds, and her hair had grown out enough to cover the spots where he'd pulled chunks out during her captivity. The scars on her wrists were fading, and she could actually smile now without it looking forced or painful. We met with the prosecutor multiple times to prepare our testimony for the trial, going over every detail of that day in the woods. The prosecutor explained that families of 7 other victims would be at the trial, finally getting answers about what happened to their loved ones after years of not knowing. The trial date came 8 months after our escape, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and people from the community who'd searched for the missing women. Samantha testified for 3 hours straight, never breaking down even when describing the worst parts of her captivity and the things she'd seen. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict him on all charges, including multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and attempted murder. At the sentencing hearing, Samantha stood up and spoke about choosing to survive and rebuild her life, and half the courtroom was crying by the time she finished. The judge sentenced him to life without any chance of parole, and you could hear people clapping even though the bailiff tried to quiet them. Samantha started visiting survivor support groups to share her story and help other people who'd been through similar trauma. She enrolled in online college courses, studying psychology because she wanted to become a counselor and help other survivors the way her therapists had helped her. She moved into her own apartment with a good security system and adopted a rescue dog who slept next to her bed every night. Almost exactly 1 year after that day in the woods, my phone buzzed with a photo message from Samantha. She was wearing a cap and gown, holding her diploma, surrounded by her sister and parents and cousins, her face glowing with pride and accomplishment. She'd finished her associate degree in record time and was already accepted into a bachelor's program at the state university. We still text every few weeks, sometimes about serious stuff, but mostly just normal life things like her new job at a crisis center or the funny thing her dog did. That day in the woods bonded us forever, but we both worked hard to move forward and not let it define everything about our lives. She sends me updates when she helps another survivor find their strength, and I know those other women are lucky to have someone who really understands what they've been through. The trauma never fully goes away, but Samantha proved you can build something meaningful from even the worst experiences if you refuse to let evil win. Thanks for hanging out with me and wandering through all those moments. Definitely been a fun little journey asking questions together. I'll catch you around next time. Like the video, it helps more than you think.